So we have a visitor today in the Observer offices, Will Potter, who actually used to report from the Observer about a decade or so ago, and has a new book out, Green is the New Red, which is about how law enforcement is targeting environmental activists. So Will, you open your book with this really intriguing story, which I'm sure was not really intriguing at the time, but actually rather scary. But the FBI came and visited you at your home. So why were they looking for you, and how did you react to that visit?
So at the time I was working at the Chicago Tribune covering blood and guts, cop shop reporting, and it had taken a significant toll on me. I mean, I was really feeling pretty depressed and like I wasn't really adding anything to the world, which isn't why I got into journalism. So I decided to go leafleting with a group of people I was introduced through mutual friends. And it was part of a campaign I actually learned about through writing at the Observer against a company called Huntington Life Sciences. And so we went out and we were just leafleting. We were leafleting in a neighborhood where an executive worked that had ties to the lab, hanging door hangers on people's homes. They didn't say anything that were anywhere close to being a threat. But we were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct, which is kind of the charge that always gets thrown out when they can't get anything else to stick. And weeks later, the FBI knocked on my door and they said, do you know the type of people you're associating with? And if you don't help us out, if you don't become an informant, we'll put you on the domestic terrorist list. And this was less than a year after September 11th. I guess about 6 or 8 months after. So it was quite startling. I mean, and I talk about this in the book. You read about stories like this, and I think everyone wants to think, oh, I wouldn't flinch. I would be so firm in my beliefs. I would know what they're doing is wrong. I wouldn't be afraid at all, and it scared the daylights out of me. And when that fear subsided, though, it really became an obsession to me to find out how, so soon after 9/11, priorities were already focused on social protesters and not on true terrorism threats.
So did you ever hear again from those FBI agents?
I didn't. And they made some other threats, and they said my girlfriend at the time, they were going to visit her at work. They were going to make sure she didn't get into a PhD program, and she did. They're going to make sure I didn't get a Fulbright I applied for, and I didn't, but I mean, it's a Fulbright. So it's one of those things, you don't know the scope.
But they knew you had applied.
Oh yeah, and they rattled off a long list of things they knew about me. I mean, I was broke as can be when we moved up there. And so, my parents co-signed on the place and they knew all about that. They knew where they worked, mentioned my Metro desk editor at the Tribune by name, all these things that were meant to be unnerving, and they were.
So for people who don't know, what was going on in this campaign that had attracted the FBI's attention in the campaign against Huntington Life Sciences, which was an animal testing facility?
Right. It was part of an international campaign. This lab had 2 facilities, one in the US and one in the UK. They had been exposed multiple times with really egregious animal welfare violations. So a lot of activists really viewed this as the worst of the worst. And the campaign, for the most part, focused on targeting anyone who did business with that lab, kind of the anti-apartheid movement style, but kicked up a few notches. And the war room of the campaign was this website where anything related to the campaign got published. So when I went out leafleting, which is obviously lawful First Amendment activity, often some things like that would get posted on the website, and then the next day it might be something from someone else in Illinois who anonymously broke windows at a lab or at and vandalized an ATM. And it was all, to a lot of people in the campaign, they supported all of it. So the key organizers in that actually were later, a couple of years later, indicted on terrorism charges and ultimately convicted for conspiracy to violate the animal enterprise or commit animal enterprise terrorism. Not that they actually did any of the bad things they put on the website, but through their website, it was part of a conspiracy, and they served between 1 and 6 years.
So, in your book, you talk a lot about how the government has classified these actions like sabotage and vandalism as terrorism. So how has that distinction changed the way that law enforcement deals and prosecutes these crimes?
In a few ways. I mean, at the most basic level, it changes the resources that are available, what types of law enforcement agencies are involved. For instance, in some of these Earth Liberation Front cases, which is an underground group that's been involved in property destruction, you have Department of Homeland Security, FBI, local law enforcement, all working together with other state agencies too. So a lot of money and time going into this. But also on the legal level, it changes how people are defined in the court system. For a lot of these cases, before people even set foot in a courtroom, they're labeled terrorists, which obviously skews how they're perceived by the jurors and by the judge and by everyone. And then for those who've been convicted, that label follows them throughout the prison system. And now that some people have been released, it follows them through the rest of their lives. How they're classified in prison, how they try to move on with their lives. So that label really affects every aspect of law enforcement.
And I assume longer sentences would be part of that?
You know, that's actually kind of surprising. For instance, in the backfire cases I mentioned, the government pushed for what's called a terrorism enhancement, which has never been used against environmentalists before this. And so that ratcheted up their potential sentences, and then the government turned around and prosecutors lowered them again because some people had become government informants. So it's really more of a bargaining tool to instill fear in people and say, well, we're applying this terrorism enhancement to you. You could potentially be sent to prison for life as a terrorist. And they see how terrorists are treated, alleged terrorists in the criminal justice system, and it scares the daylight out of people. And they try to use that to coerce testimony and to make the prosecutor's job easier.
And how does law enforcement justify the use of the terrorism label, and why do you think that's inappropriate?
It actually was really interesting to see it from their perspective. For instance, the Department of Justice Inspector General did an audit in 2003 that I just came across in my research, and buried in this is a recommendation that the FBI not classify them this way, animal rights and environmental activists in particular. And the FBI responded and said, we disagree. We think this is the best use of, the best model for investigating these activists. That it's terrorism because it's destroying corporate and government property, and they stood by it. So there's tension that you don't see on the surface, but actually in law enforcement of how this is dealt with. To me, one of the takeaway messages from all this is that's what should concern everybody, no matter how you feel about the people in my book, or the things they did or didn't do, or even the movement they're a part of. Using law enforcement resources in this way affects everyone. And it affects everyone in the sense that it makes people afraid to use their First Amendment rights. And that chilling effect, it should really be a concern to everyone, regardless of what social movement you care about.
Well, that was my next question, actually. You talk about how FBI is actually called eco-terrorism its #1 domestic terrorism priority. Is that still the case?
That's been used largely as a rhetorical tool. I don't think there's any list necessarily of domestic terrorism priorities, but FBI agents and DHS also have said this in congressional hearings, and most importantly in the media. That's been their soundbite. However, I don't see anything that's indicated a change in those priorities, in particular since the Obama administration. The same policies are in place. And I think that really reflects that this has been institutionalized.
So what would you say would be a better way to handle, things that are, unequivocally crimes like arson and things like that? How should law enforcement deal with those crimes?
Well, and as you just said, I don't think there's any question that some of the things in my book are crimes. And I'm not disputing that in the least. And they should be prosecuted as crimes. And so that means working leads, investigating them, collecting evidence, the conventional model of law enforcement. And instead, we're seeing a shift in law enforcement from that to kind of just gathering all the information we can about people, particularly using terrorism databases and things like this, and then trying to filter out little particles and build a case. So in my mind, I'm not questioning the fact that these are being prosecuted, But if you believe they should be prosecuted, there's a much more effective or rational way about doing that. I would argue this is really about sending a message. The use of terrorism resources doesn't make that investigation easier, but it does have more of an impact when you see that headline in the press. You see that headline in the press release, the media sound bites, the congressional hearings, and I think that's what all this is about.
Okay. Hey, thanks a lot for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
All right.